is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise, to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future.
It's David's son Solomon who eventually succeeds his father as king. Solomon completes David's plans to build a temple in Jerusalem, a permanent place of worship to God. But Solomon's life moves further and further away from God. He starts to worship idols until his heart is distant from God. Solomon is succeeded by his son Rehoboam, under whom the nation of God's people divides. Rehoboam comes down hard on the northern tribes and they reject him as king. And so the kingdom is broken in two. The northern tribes retain the name Israel for their kingdom, and the southern tribes take on the name Judah for theirs. Under King David, there had been unity, prosperity, there had been growth, but now under David's family, there is that deceit, division, and destruction. All of this is covered in the books of the Bible called 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Historical records which overlap in terms of time frame and which chart the trajectory of the different monarchs. Things go mostly from bad to worse. As we read through 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we get little snippets about how each of the kings is doing. So for example, sometime in and around the 700s BC, 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles tells us that there's a king named Pekah who's ruling in Israel in the north, and a king named Ahaz who's ruling in Judah in the south. Let's go to the Bible to take a look at their report cards. Pekah, son of Remaliah, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 20 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And this is what the majority of the accounts are like. Now, there are exceptions, but largely God's people, under the poor example set by their kings, are moving further and further away from God. This all comes at a cost. Throughout this period, God sends prophets, people who speak on his behalf, to warn of a coming judgment. The book of the Bible called Isaiah is named for one of these prophets, and that book begins with exactly that kind of warning. There is trouble in store for God's disobedient people. That trouble comes in the form of enemy nations. God removes his protection from his people, and Israel and Judah are conquered by the empires of Assyria and Babylon. The Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar II would lead his armies against God's people, invading the southern kingdom of Judah, besieging the city of Israel, and then taking many of God's people captive, and eventually leaving Jerusalem in ruins. The book of Daniel tells the story of some of those captives as they're escorted away from their home. Imagine yourself in their shoes. Their country invaded, their cities destroyed, their families escorted hundreds of miles away to live in the strange land of Babylon. God's people left records for us. They wrote verses and songs expressing their grief in this time. The book of the Bible called Lamentations is exactly that, a collection of poems lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. And in the collection of writings we call the Psalms, which spans many periods of history, we also find words of grief from God's dislocated people. Here's the opening words of Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Using another word there for Jerusalem. This was the exile. It was a period of tremendous hardship in the history of God's people. But one thing remained throughout.